So welcome to the last technical session of the conference. Glad to see you are all still here. I think we're going to have a very interesting discussion here for the next hour and 15 minutes on our system integration symposium on large-scale renewable energy integration into electricity grids. As you all know, the electricity grid is under a lot of challenges these days for a variety of reasons, and is potentially limiting our ability to install further renewables into it. And as our end-use energy becomes more and more electrified, it's going to just keep putting increasing demands on the grid. So this afternoon we have 4 outstanding speakers that are going to address various aspects of this issue. By the way, this symposium was inspired by Nextracker, one of the sponsors of this Congress, and Dan Sugar in particular thought this would be a good type of discussion to have. So I'm really pleased that we have them as a sponsor, and I'm pleased that we got such excellent speakers. So we have Dr. Richard Perez, Professor Emeritus from the State University of New York at Albany. Also, he's been doing consulting with many companies and is continuing doing consulting with many companies like Clean Power Research. And he's going to start off the discussion talking about firm photovoltaic power, a very important concept so that we can rely on PV as a dispatchable resource to the utility system. And then following Richard, we'll have Debra Liu. She's currently the Executive Director, I guess, or President of the Energy Systems Integration Group, and she'll be talking about more high-level issues associated with grid integration of renewables. Following her will be Ben Kroposki. Dr. Ben Kroposki is currently a very well-known scientist at NREL, and he'll talk about inverter-based grids, or the idea of converting from a spinning type of inverter or AC system to an inverter-based system in the grids, which is a very important issue that we're facing right now. And then finally, Dr. Lori Bird, who's also an NREL alumnus. We have a kind of an NREL alumni reunion going on here. And she's from the World Resources Institute, and she'll be talking about policy aspects related with grid integration. So with that said, I want to start with Dr. Perez, our first speaker, who will talk about firm PV power. Thank you.
Thank you, Dave. Good afternoon. So the title of the talk is Meeting Growing Electrical Demand. It's growing, building electrification, car electrification, maybe server farms. I'd like to address the renewable resource adequacy solutions. Can we do it with renewables only, and how much will that cost? And at the heart of that solution is what we call firm power generation, optimally transforming the viable renewable energy like wind and solar into firm power generator available 24/365. So that's a solar resource somewhere in the US that would be in the southwest US. That's 1 year of hourly data. You can see it's quite variable. This is wind resource in a windy site. It's even more variable. And this is the demand that has to be met. So it's like feeding a square peg into round holes. It doesn't really match. So let's focus on a few days here and dive deeper into that interaction between the renewables and that load. So traditionally, that's a regional load, and the way that load has been met traditionally is with base load resources from nuclear, large hydro, and there is a variable portion which is met by dispatchable generation. And when we put run-of-the-weather resources, wind and solar in that case, I have 50-50 mix of wind and solar on that load. It looks okay. You get some peak shaving going, 5% energy penetration, no big issues. But when I augment the penetration, here I'm at 15%, you can see issues starting to rise. The underlying load is less predictable, steeper ramps, you have dirt curves beginning to show up. Then at 30%, I'm already going into the base load generators, which cannot be managed. I'm only at 50% here, and you can see that it's a big nightmare, it's a problem. That's the underlying code, in my opinion, for exceeding hosting capacities, negative market prices, reactive curtailments, the utility cut the PPAs out of circuit. You have deployment moratoriums happening more and more. Even France had a moratorium for a while, a couple of months. You have growing interconnection queues, and one of the underlying reasons why those things cannot connect is that because they don't fit. And you have also a tug of war between the power producers, the renewables, and the grid operators, because they don't speak the same language, so they are antagonized. So yeah, wealth of issue developing. So we have that unconstrained VRE solution, which is pretty much the way renewables have been deployed up to date and continue to be deployed. And that one of the things that Mark discussed this morning is that it will take conventional approaches, that we need a super grid to handle that. What we do with firm power vision is that we are going to transform the VREs into something equals to load shape, so that same wind and solar resource become exactly equal to the load you can meet. And when you do that, you can see the penetration is seamless. And that can happen locally, and we've seen that it doesn't require any major grid buildup to achieve that. So how do you do that transformation? There are 4 basic things that should be done, other things on top of that, but the 4 key things is to blend the wind and solar resource because they have different attributes optimally, and that optimum depends on where you are. You use, of course, storage, which can be expensive, but it's very efficient at displacing the load. If you have excess, you put it into storage. When you don't have enough, you take it back from storage. You need implicit storage, and that's the one that's outside the box. It's not in the system yet, but that's the one that makes things happen cheaply. And that's the way it works. This is a cost of firm power generation. See, if I look at the unconstrained wind and solar, it's the cheapest way of making electricity today. It's very, very cheap, run of the weather. But if I'm going to transform it into firm power with storage only, without curtailment, it's a non-starter proposition. It's way too expensive. But there is a workable proposition which involved overbuilding. So if I overbuild and throw out some of the solar output, the green part is not monetized. I can reduce the blue part to my cost, which is the storage contribution, to the point where the firm power generation become close to affordability. And the last leg of that transformation includes some degree of flexibility that can happen on the demand side. I tend to prefer the supply side because we already do that today with the dispatchable generation. Today it uses natural gas, but that same technology can be used with e-fuel. And if you're unfamiliar with e-fuel, that's something that's at the horizon and that's coming in a big way. It's the transformation, production of hydrogen in sunny places of the world, windy places. You make hydrogen, you combine it with carbon, biogenic carbon and oxygen, and you can make any fuel you want out of that. And there are big companies investing big dollars into that today. The European Community already mandates 2% of the fuel from flying airplanes in Europe to be e-fuel based, and that percentage is scheduled to grow all the way to 100% in the future. So we're going to fly plane on kerosene, but that's going to be solar kerosene. It's very expensive. It's about 5 times the price of natural gas, but as you will see, it does the job to make photovoltaic and wind firm power generation affordably. These are the type of costs we see by 2050 with 100% renewable in different countries. These are the groups I work with at the IEA. We do study in many countries. We have done up to 10 countries today already. And you can see this is pretty close to the current generation cost on ISOs in the US, 5 to 6 cents. And that doesn't include any subsidies, no tax credit, no subsidies. So if governments want to encourage it and add subsidies to make it happen, those could be divided by, if you put a 30% tax credit on top of that, you reduce that cost by 30%. And even today, we came close to that. We've done a study in Nova Scotia, and we had a poster on it, but even today, if you apply that optimum mix of 25% PV, 70% wind, and 5% e-fuel generation in that Canadian province, you can generate power cheaper than they do today. They have a lot of oil-based generation. That's why it's already below parity today. I'm going to go a little bit deeper on Nova Scotia just because it's the most recent study I did, and it's also a study where we actually look at the future load. So that's Nova Scotia, that little province in the Atlantic side of Canada. But we are going to look at the future load in 2050, which will include fully transformed building and transportation sectors, all electric. So our first job to do that was to, we don't know the future load, but was to estimate it as smartly as we could. So we started from the current load of that province. These are hourly data. You can see it's winter peaking. They don't have much AC, and they're pretty cold in winter. So it's a difficult case for solar, apparently. But they already use electric heat. So we use that to estimate the portion of the load that's traceable to electric heat. They use a lot of baseboard, so we can know exactly what it would take to electrify everything by looking at how the building stock will evolve by 2050 and by converting everything that uses oil today to an equal share of baseboards and heat pumps. And we can create the future heating demand in that province. For transportation, we did something quite similar. We took their whole fleet of cars and trucks, how many miles they drive, took some common sense assumption on how much electricity that would require, used daily charging profiles and yearly charging profiles for those vehicles, and we could generate that future electric load on top of everything else. So all in all, we have a load that's almost double because of electrification by 2050, and that's pretty commensurate when we talk to ISOs in the country. They see that type of growth because of electrification. So that's well in the ballpark. So we have that future load. We have wind resource in Nova Scotia, which is quite variable, high capacity factor, but doesn't look anything like the load, except that it happens to be also winter peaking. We have PV, summer peaking, also low capacity factor. We price those loads we use the 2020 NREL ATB to price the cost of PV and wind in the future. We have batteries priced at 40 per kilowatt, 65 per kilowatt hour. We have supply side flexibility. That's your e-fuel dispatchable generation. So we consider brand new turbines at 850 per kilowatt. And you can see the OPEX is 18 cents per kilowatt hour. It's about 5 times the cost of natural gas. So it's a very expensive resource, but it's totally dispatchable, flexible. We have run-of-the-river hydro, a little portion of it that we are not going to manage. We're going to let it run. And of course, we have that famous implicit storage. So we have that dispatching flow for the Nova Scotia grid, where you have PV, wind, and the load minus hydro. And if PV and wind is below the load, you dispatch it fully. If it's too big, you put it into storage. If the storage is full, you curtail, i.e. you apply implicit storage. And that diagram is familiar to the people who have designed the islanded system, like Homer. That's exactly the way it works. We just take that to the utility scale, to the TSO scale when we do that. And that's we optimize that for the least cost configuration, how much of each resource do you need, and that's the bottom line for Nova Scotia. In terms of energy on the left, in terms of capacity at the center, so it's dominated by wind. Wind is winter peaking, it's very high resource, but still a good chunk of PV. You see the e-fuel occupies 5%, but look at the LCOE achieved in the province, 4.50 cents per kilowatt hour generation cost based on that resource, 100% renewable. I draw your attention to the fact that the current cost is 9 cents, so it's much cheaper than the generation cost today on the province. And look at that implicit storage. That's achieved that we have to sacrifice to waste, quote unquote waste, 20% of the VRE output to get to that low cost. If we don't do that, we're at almost 12 cents per kilowatt hour. So that, as Mark showed this morning, implicit storage, being willing to over-design and waste some of the resource, has tremendous value. It's a 1-to-3 ratio. You can grab that report at the Natural Resource Canada. I have the chart here if you want to take a peek, but I'll be happy to share that with you afterwards. I draw your attention on that e-fuel thing here because I presented that at the New York ISO a couple of weeks ago, and they're struggling to maintain the grid alive because the state imposed to them a lot of dispatch of PV and wind, and they are mandating installing new generating capacity. And we agreed that, yeah, go ahead, install it today. In the future, you will be powering it with clean fuel. So it's not a bad thing to do, and you can present that. So they were really jazzed by the fact that the grid of the future will include their current plan to make up for that unmanageable renewables. So the takeaways of that work that we have at the IEA, situation with vastly different environments indicate that 100% self-contained grids can be economically viable. Implicit storage, aka overbuild and curtail, is central to achieving that. If you don't do it, it's not economical. Seasonal storage and large-scale interconnection are not indispensable. Expensive e-fuel generation, even if it costs 5 times the cost of natural gas, is a very useful catalyst to make it happen. Engaging the distribution resource, I didn't talk about that here, but at the IEA we also look at all the solar systems on the distribution side as well as transmission side would participate in that firm power equation. So all the systems, small and big. And last but not least, the new market rules are needed to make that happen. Today, that thing cannot be deployed, implemented, because overbuild curtailed is not monetizable, even though it's the ticket to the low-cost solution. You cannot make it happen because it's considered as a loss in the current system. And you need intelligence to operate everything in synchronicity and smartly to deliver that load shape. So you need virtual power plant operators that would orchestrate. So our next task as EIE, and that's very exciting to me, is that to think what those new market rules should look like in the future. So currently we have the existing market, which is addressed to power producers. They bid, and it's an energy-based market, day-ahead market, the merit order effect, the highest price takes all, and it's all energy-based. There should be a separate market addressed to the VREs, to that variable resources, that will not be addressed to the current power producers, but to the VPPs that will orchestrate all those underlying resources. And that market will not be energy-based. It will be capacity-based, deliver load shape for a given price. And that could be consistent with the PPA we have today, but it will be a different animal. That curtailment will be part of that equation. And on that, I hope I didn't drag too long, Dave, but I'll take question at the end if you have.
Thanks very much, Richard. That's really important work. And as I said before, we'll go through all the 4 talks now, and then we'll have a Q&A as time permits toward the end. Next, we have Dr. Debra Liu. She's the CEO of the Energy Systems Integration Group and also an NREL alumnus.
So I have a very different take on this than Richard, so maybe we'll have a really good discussion later. For those of you who don't know ESIG, Energy Systems Integration Group, there's our QR code. I encourage you to go take a look. All of our workshops, our webinars are recorded, freely available, reports freely available, join the mailing list. So you can easily operate a grid with 100% renewables if you're Iceland, right? If you're blessed with abundant hydro and geothermal resources that are not variable in a very fast time scale and are not inverter-based but synchronous conventional generator-based, this is really easy and has been done. But for the rest of us, we're looking at decarbonizing with the more ubiquitous and the very cheap wind and solar. And the grid's got to be reliable, and solar and wind have impacts on reliability. So I think about reliability in terms of 3 time frames. So on the far right, you've got the years time frame where, let's see if this works. Is it this? We're talking about resource adequacy. We're talking about probabilistic analysis to meet that 1-day and 10-year criteria of loss of load. We're talking about seasonal mismatch of supply and demand and periods of low wind, solar, hydro. They call them Dunkelflaute in Germany. Now, in the days, hours time frame, we have system balancing. This is what the system operator like Cal ISO does on a daily basis. And there we deal with the duck curve, we deal with variability and uncertainty in solar and wind. And then in the very fast time frames, like seconds time frames, sub-seconds, we got stability issues. And these are things having to do with disturbances and the fact that solar, wind, batteries are all connected to the grid through an inverter. So in a nutshell, these 3 things are, did I build enough stuff? Can I balance the system every hour? And can I recover from a disturbance? And Ben is going to talk about this, and I'm going to talk about these 2 here. And my assertion is that the 2 big challenges to high levels of wind and solar are at these far ends. It's this whole stability challenge that Ben will talk about, and this whole resource adequacy challenge that I'm going to talk about. And I'm going to talk about potential solutions as well. So first thing to note, we can integrate high levels of wind and solar into the grid. Denmark is about 70% on an annual average basis, right? So last year, about 70% of their electricity came from solar and wind. And just for comparison, the US is down here at like 17%, including rooftop solar, according to statistics on EIA. So my first point is that we need an affordable solution to the clean, firm, or long-duration storage technology, that batteries are not enough. So these are decarbonization scenarios for New England. This is a study from E3. On the left, this is 92% reduction in carbon in New England. And here's a bunch of scenarios. Base case, one where they allow for new nukes and carbon capture sequestration, and one where they say, let's not do that. Let's not build new gas. Let's do it all with batteries. And so you can see they build a lot more capacity of resources. And the thing is, I can't see it very well here, but on this right-hand graphic in blue, I've circled the costs for these scenarios. So basically, the base case cost is here. If you can use carbon capture or nukes, it reduces the cost. If you restrict the cases to just using batteries, not building new gas, then the cost is double. And this cost increase gets more severe when you go to 100% reduction in carbon. So you basically have to build huge amounts of new batteries, and it ends up costing you 5 times as much. So this is, we can do this, but it'll cost us a huge amount and will not be affordable. So there are different things we need to think about because we don't yet have this silver bullet technology. Our current finding in the studies, and this is from NREL's 100% by 2035 study, is that we keep the fossil plants around and we just never run them except during stress periods. So what you can see here is in this study, NREL did a whole bunch of sensitivities. And in all the sensitivities, you can see they build out tons of solar, they build out tons of wind, they build out lots of batteries. And then if you look down here, the fossil fleet without carbon capture sequestration, it's flat, right? So they keep that fossil fleet. They perhaps build new fossil during that time as old fossil retires until 2033. And then in 2033, depending on what scenario you look at, something changes. The bottom line is that we need to solve this clean, firm, or long duration storage challenge. Now, there are things that we can do to help mitigate this. One of the big things we can do is to build transmission. This is a study that we did at ESIG, and it's showing, this is Texas ERCOT, and this is Southern Company in the southeast. And we found that a 2 gigawatt transmission line connecting these two regions acts like 4 gigawatts of new gas capacity. It acts like 2 gigawatts of new gas capacity in ERCOT during the winter period when they're stressed, and it acts like 2 gigawatts of new gas capacity in Southern Company in the summer when they are stressed. And the reason is they've got different periods of stress. And these savings from transmission can be substantial. So this is from DOE's National Transmission Planning Study, and what this is showing on the left, these are net savings. So what I mean by that is take the total benefits of that transmission minus the total cost of that transmission. And these are the net savings when you allow regions to share resource adequacy or capacity with each other. So what this blue bar is showing is that even if I don't build any new interregional transmission, I just use the grid as it is today, just by turning on the sharing between regions, we could save $240 billion. And then in this red case, this is the big HVDC macro grid, build lots of grid case. You can save more money. And on the far right, what this is showing is that when you turn on that sharing between regions, you build more grid. But it's worth it. The savings are worth building the more grid. The last thing I wanted to point out is demand flexibility. This is a huge underutilized solution. So this is Arizona Public Service. They have a huge amount of solar. They manage a significant duck curve, just like California does. Now what they do is they've got two big ways of managing their demand. One is through rates, and the second is through their DER programs. So first of all, they've got 2/3 of their customers on time of use rates, right? Peak and off-peak periods. And that acts like a giant battery, right? It acts like a giant battery where when the load grows, your battery grows with it. They've got a super off-peak rate in the winter that's 10 times lower than their peak rate, right? So it really encourages people to push their consumption to the middle of the day solar hours. And then they've got this DER program, like thermostats, water heaters, batteries, controllable solar output, and they use that program to help manage when their peak rate stops and the off-peak rate starts, right? 'Cause you can imagine when that change happens in your time of use rate at 7 o'clock, everyone's turning on their electric vehicles, right, charging and whatever else they want to turn on. And so the DERs help them ease over that bump in demand. And you can see this is what it looks like when you deploy it. I'm just pointing out this is August 2020. During this period in California, they had rolling blackouts. Arizona did not have rolling blackouts, and this is part of the reason why. Finally, I want to talk about the future of demand flexibility, where I think this is going to go. Where I think this is going to go is in terms of us actually exposing large loads. So think about data centers, think about industrial heat electrification, think about hydrogen electrolysis or electric vehicle fleet charging, exposing them to wholesale prices and having them actually be responding to those prices as price responsive demand. And this is an example. This is from Texas. This is actually a cryptocurrency mining operation, but anyway, here's how it looks like. This red line here is the load break-even price for that load, and you can see that every time the ERCOT spot price, which is in blue, goes above the break-even price, their demand, which is in green, drops by like 90%. So the point of this is that we can have demand be very flexible, respond to prices, especially starting with these large loads that are proliferating more and more, and we can have the system operator now not just balance the supply side like they do today, but balance both the supply and the demand side. This could, in principle, enhance reliability, reduce the need for reserves, making things cheaper. And in addition, this kind of response doesn't require monitoring and verification and a baseline and all of that. All you do is you meter these loads, just like you meter all of our loads. So no new stuff needs to happen. In any case, those are the three things I just wanted to leave you with: the need for clean, firm, or long-duration storage, the need for transmission, and the need for demand flexibility. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Debbie. Yes, I can see where there's going to be room for discussion at the end of this session here. And next, I'd like to have Ben. You're right here. Ben is not an alumnus of NREL. He's a current NRELian, and he will be talking to us about inverter-based systems.
Hi, I'm Ben Kroposki. I'm the director of the Power System Engineering Center at NREL. So the place where we actually integrate all of these technologies that we talk about, wind, solar, any of the other renewables, geothermal, hydro, all into the electric power system and make that work properly. So what I'm going to talk about is how we actually are trying to improve the overall stability of the grid with new technologies around these, what we call inverter-based resources. So inverter-based resources means that we have some piece of power electronics that sit between the primary resource like solar or wind or energy storage and connect that to the electric power grid. The electric power grid is typically run by synchronous generator-based machines, so things like nuclear plants, gas plants, hydropower plants, those all have large rotating machines inside of them, creating a AC waveform. Inverters take that DC power from photovoltaics or from most wind turbines. They actually have DC on the inside, or battery energy storage, and convert that to AC. But these inverter-based resources are really providing this pathway to large-scale, reliable grids. Again, as Debbie mentioned, right now it's about 17% of the annual energy across the United States, but there are some regions, as you can see in here, that have much higher levels across the continental United States. So in the Southwest Power Pool, mostly wind, but 37% on an annual energy basis provided by wind and solar energy. And in ERCOT, or the Texas grid, it's around 34%. So those are huge amounts of energy being provided by wind and solar today. Over the last 30 years, the wind and solar industry has really expanded tremendously to be able to provide this level of energy across the system. So as I mentioned before, the differences between synchronous generators and inverters, this is kind of where I live, which is the rotating AC machines on synchronous generator power plants. They produce that AC waveform that you can kind of see down here, if we take a look, right? So this AC waveform. DC-based machines, so photovoltaics, wind turbines, battery energy storage, they use power electronics to recreate something that looks just like that AC waveform, and they synchronize together. The key thing to realize, though, is that there are some differences on the control algorithms that are used to create this AC waveform. And most of the devices that we have connected to the electric power grid today are what we call grid-following inverters. So grid-following inverters, as the name would apply, they look for the AC waveform from the big machines, they synchronize to it, and then they just follow along and inject power into that system. That works great as long as there's big machines sitting there. If the big machines go out, if people don't have noticed this before, if you have PV on your roof and you don't have a battery energy storage system, that PV system turns off because it no longer has the grid to synchronize to. Now, the other type of inverter is what we call grid-forming inverters. Now, grid-forming inverters, nothing really new. We use these on off-grid systems, standalone systems, but now what we're doing is using that same control technology on large-scale grid systems. So again, the big difference between grid following and grid forming is that grid following needs to see the grid to follow it. And if the grid goes away, that inverter shuts down and stops producing power. Grid forming, on the other hand, it actually controls the voltage and frequency, creates its own waveform. It is able to synchronize to the grid correctly, but it can also provide additional services. It actually has a much faster response to grid disturbances. So when we see a problem on the grid, these grid-forming inverters can actually help stabilize the grid much quicker. The other thing is, if the grid goes down, these type of inverters can actually black start the grid and restore the system to normal operating conditions. So I won't dive into a lot of technical detail when we talk about all of these little bits and pieces of inverter-based resources. I'll just mention that in general, we kind of lump them into several different categories of technical issues that we need to take care of to make sure that large-scale deployments of inverter-based resources work properly. We need to make sure that they act in a stable manner when they see a grid disturbance. So if the frequency comes off of 60 hertz when you lose a large generator and declines, you want those inverters to actually help the system up a little bit very quickly. So this is all happening in a very short time frame, much less than a second, to bring that system frequency back to normal operation. There's issues around how we actually protect the system, how we recognize fault conditions on the grid, and the difference between inverter-based resources and synchronous generators. We want to have the black start capability from inverter-based resources, because if we're operating grids at near 100% inverter-based resources, we need those systems to be able to fully restart the grid. And we also need to understand the interaction and oscillations that happen when you have multiples of different inverter-based resources pushed together. Okay, so lots of kind of technical details, but the good news is there are people working on all of these things, and we know how to operate power grids at a variety of scales with very high levels of inverter-based resources. So if you take a look at this graph right here, you'll see it's kind of split into three different areas: small island grids, large island grids, and then just large grids. And this is system size in terms of the peak demand in gigawatts. So we're not talking tiny little things here. This is going from a small island power system that you may have on a remote Pacific island all the way up to the continental United States. Then you see percent wind and solar here on this axis. And then the other two things that you see a bunch of numbers on here. The gray numbers in the circles are the annual energy provided. So that's usually, and what we've been talking about when we say percent of energy over a year being provided by wind and solar. But the more important number to a power system engineer is actually this red square. That's the instantaneous amount of wind and solar or inverter-based resource at any point in time. Because we need it to be stable at any point in time, not just over the entire year. So if you take a look at these small island systems, heck, we know how to build 100% renewable grids. We can do it right now. How do we do it? Well, to make that happen, we have to oversize the amount of solar. We have to oversize the amount of energy storage on those islands, basically providing 3 days of autonomy for these type of island power systems. But we know how to do that pretty well. As we start to get larger and larger systems, you'll see that annual energy number come down. So we're backfilling with different fossil fuels, typically like a diesel fuel on an island system. And then when we get to larger island systems, it's a variety of different fuels. Now, these larger island grids, they're really important right now. These are some amazing pieces of engineering. So right now, the island of Kauai and Maui basically run at 50% wind and solar for the entire year, and instantaneously up to 90% at any particular point in time. And we're working with those islands specifically to get them to 100% renewable systems. Again, how do you get there? You got to add more energy storage, and you need those grid-forming inverters that I talked about earlier. So that's what's going to help them reach those levels. Even as we push to these larger grids, as we mentioned, I'll mention ERCOT. So that system right now, 34% annually from wind and solar. Amazing. If you think about how much wind and solar that is, it is a lot. And instantaneously up to 76%. So we're working actually with ERCOT right now on developing standards and codes for them to implement grid-forming inverters on the new large-scale batteries that are going into ERCOT. And when I say large-scale, I'm talking like batteries that are 300 megawatts in size. These are huge battery systems. We're talking gigawatts upon gigawatts of I think they have over 40 gigawatts of wind, over 30 gigawatts of solar. These are huge numbers of deployed wind and solar systems that are operating that grid. Now, you don't see Denmark on here because each of these systems that I listed are their own independent synchronous AC grids, and that means they have to solve all their problems. Denmark's a little bit of a special case in that it's tied to the rest of the European grid and can move power outside of the Denmark area over to Germany and into Norway. But even as we look at this, some of the key lessons learned about these actual, real operating systems is that if we can make sure that these inverter-based resources properly integrate into the electric power grid, have some level of grid forming capability, and we start to add much more energy storage to the system, we can really achieve really large-scale deployment of renewables. So I'll just mention, if you're interested in this topic anymore, come check out a consortium that I lead called the Unify Consortium, where we're unifying the integration of inverter-based resources and synchronous generators. We're developing standard requirements, technical models and controls, testing and commissioning procedures. Lots of information there. If you check out our website, unifyconsortium.org, and also visit our channel on YouTube, you can find out anything you ever wanted to learn about grid-forming inverters. You can see the large number of partners that we have that are all working together to make this a reality. So with that, I'll say thank you, and we'll have our last speaker come up. So thanks.
That was really interesting. Great to see how we get some island nations that are getting almost up to 100% full-time renewable energy. Our last speaker is going to be Dr. Lori Bird. She's also an NREL alumnus and currently with the World Resource Institute. And she's going to speak with us about the policy aspects of grid integration systems.
So I was just given an honorary doctorate, so that's kind of cool. I don't have one. I get that all the time, though, because I've written a lot of journal articles, so I get the emails to Dr. Bird all the time. So yeah, my world, I direct the U.S. Energy Program at the World Resources Institute. I don't know if folks are familiar with WRI, but we are a pretty large global environmental organization. We're at 2,300 people or 2,400 these days around the world. I'm part of the U.S. program office focusing on energy issues, but we have offices in India, China, Indonesia, Mexico, I think 8 country offices overall. So lots of work going on. My team really focuses on accelerating demand for clean energy. We focus heavily on policy, but also implementation, and been very occupied by all of the federal policy changes in the last administration and the current one as well, but we also work a lot with states and local governments. So I'll talk a little bit about the shifting policy landscape, kind of what we're looking at. The Biden administration was very focused on trying to get to 100% clean energy on the systems. and setting policy direction, and Congress was moving in that direction to try to drive us there. In the past, number of years, states have also been moving in that direction and trying to encourage. There are quite a few states that have 100% clean electricity standards, and have been changing those over time. They started as renewable electricity standards for 20% of the utility generation mix, and then they have increased over time. And many states have shifted to 100% clean energy standards by 2040 and 2050. So, that's the policy landscape. We're also in a, the current administration has been taking action to actually dismantle everything that was done under the Inflation Reduction Act, as you all know, I'm sure, if you're following this closely. So a lot of the policies that were done under the Biden administration, they're being undone, including the tax incentives for wind and solar in particular. The tax incentives have been preserved for nuclear, longer term, for nuclear, geothermal, and some other technologies. So there's more incentive to try to invest in those going forward. There have been also, I think most disturbing has been a lot of efforts to try to throw up additional barriers to wind and solar deployment in the U.S. in the near term, in addition to just reduction in the tax credits, but barriers to permitting and siting and trying to get projects approved. So we'll have to see how some of that plays out, but it is certainly slowing the pace of renewables deployment and expectations in the coming years. But on the other hand, the other factor that's critical right now is that we're seeing load growth that's been unprecedented, that we have not seen for many years, right? Loads have been fairly steady for quite some time, but now with a number of factors, a lot of it, there's a lot of attention on data centers right now driving new demand, with AI data centers in particular, very large facilities that are coming online, and trying to serve those loads is something that's a real challenge for the industry, and just there's recognition of how big of a problem this is, and actually a lot of uncertainty in those estimates too, that they're probably overestimated in terms of some of the capacity that needs to come online, but still very large numbers. So we're actually going to need the wind and solar to meet these loads in the coming years, because it's the things that we can build most quickly to meet those loads. And it's not just data centers that are driving load growth. It's also, we still do have significant electrification and manufacturing loads. So this is sort of the shifting landscape, and I'm just going to show a slide from the Princeton Repeat project about what their assessment is of some of the policy changes in terms of the generation mix, in terms of how much solar we would get online, and solar and wind. They're estimating about 30 gigawatts less solar, 43 gigawatts less wind by 2030 because of the new mega bill that was adopted by Congress and the removal of the tax credits. I think it remains to be seen what's going to happen with some of the rulemaking that still needs to happen to implement the new legislation, and whether that will further impede progress because of changes to the commenced construction rules that we don't know what they're going to do with that, which creates uncertainty whether people can move forward with projects, as well as the foreign entity of concern provisions that deal with how much of the supply chain in your projects can be from China, essentially. And those rules, very detailed language in the legislation, but we need to see the rules to make sure that people can build projects and they have sufficient components to be able to do that. So just a couple of statistics these are all from Princeton, in terms of we were hitting records, particularly with solar and batteries in the last couple of years, and now expecting some slowdown because of these policy changes. Princeton estimates by 2035 that clean energy generation will be 820 terawatt hours lower, about the size of today's nuclear fleet. And Rhodium did an analysis that showed clean power capacity reduced by 50 to 72% by 2035. So here's just a look at, this is from the Princeton study. If you look at the second column and the last one, the second column is comparing what we might see in terms of a generation mix now that we have the new mega law, budget bill, whatever you want to call it. I won't call it the big, it's the big bill. I don't like using the word beautiful. So you can see that compared to the last column would have been the generation mix under the continued policies under the Biden administration. So the solar's at the top, quite a bit more solar would have occurred. Substantially amounts more of wind under the Biden administration. We're seeing, basically more gas, coal staying online longer, a little bit more nuclear, and less wind and solar, and a more expensive generation mix, and actually a little bit less total generation under this system because of, I think, the challenges of bringing it on. So that's sort of, what some of the projections going forward based on the current environment. So, and I just wanted to provide a little bit more context on the load growth issue that we're seeing, because I think it's creating, it's a little different from what folks were talking about at a higher level in terms of integration, but I do think we're seeing, because of the size of these loads that are coming online, it's causing grid strain and concern about meeting the demand and meeting it affordably, I think, is really a huge issue that's arising. We're already starting to see major increases in PJM and other areas that are causing a lot of consternation. So just, to give a sense of the size of these loads, so data centers are about 4% of electricity today, and they could be 5 to 9% of electricity by 2030, could be even higher number. That's sort of a conservative number from EPRI, but we've seen much higher numbers. I have a graph in just a minute that shows some of the range of estimates. But in addition to that, I mentioned, we're seeing, like in the Northeast states and California, we're seeing vehicle and building electrification also playing a significant role, and manufacturing in the Southeast and Midwest that are also causing some grid strain. So, I think the key challenges here, Debbie was talking about the need for transmission. We've been very slow to bring on new transmission, and we've been behind where we needed to be on that, so it's becoming more of a critical issue. We're starting to see a lot more action on the part of policymakers to try to address some of that more quickly in terms of trying to expand the existing grid. So grid enhancing technologies, dynamic line rating, or using advanced conductors and things like that has been something that's been discussed a lot more to try to help manage the system, meet these loads, expand the capacity of the existing grid. So we have seen a lot of policy action on that front. I think there's something like 16 states now that have adopted some legislation to encourage the consideration of grid enhancing technologies or advanced transmission technologies to be able to expand capacity more quickly, because you can do that in those projects in 2 or 3 years versus 10 plus years to build new transmission, and they can be pretty cost effective. They don't handle all solutions and so forth, but that's one of the things that we're starting to see on the policy front to address the concerns about trying to meet these loads as well. Just to give a sense of where this has been too, I think this is also a little bit of a shock to the systems, and that we're just seeing it in many places across the country. One of the issues I think is that a lot of the new large loads, they're double counted, they're triple counted, right? Because they're planning these data centers and shopping them in multiple locations, right? So that's a lot of the reason why people think that the load growth numbers are overestimated, because they're double counting facilities, which is probably true. But we are seeing interest in placing these facilities in a lot of additional locations than we saw originally. So this graph, the emerging markets are in the light blue. The purple dots showed where we saw a lot of data center development historically. but then the other dots are kind of where we're seeing data centers being planned in other parts of the country. So it's hitting a lot of regions. Although I would say some of the hubs are, Virginia has been a historic hub, Texas, Chicago area, Arizona also has a lot in the West. So I think, what else is this? On the policy front, I think there's just a lot of attention to these issues, and how do we meet these loads? How do we do this without passing these costs on to other customers? So it's a critical issue that everyone is focused on. So state legislators are very focused on this issue, as well as state regulators, trying to figure out how do we bring on this new capacity to bring the new loads on. And I will mention that many of these data center companies have clean energy goals and want clean energy to meet their data center projects. So that includes folks like Google and Meta and Microsoft and Amazon and so forth, right? They have been buying huge amounts of clean energy for many years. There are also there are some data center companies too that don't have those kinds of goals. But there is demand there, I think, for clean energy as a result of these new loads. And I think what we're seeing is that they're struggling to actually use renewables to meet them, and are starting to sign other kinds of contracts. I don't know if you've seen in the news, but so for instance, Meta has a very large data center planned for the South. I think it's in Louisiana, and are planning to bring on a couple hundred megawatts of renewables to meet it, but also are bringing on some gas. And then others are looking at nuclear plants. We've seen several deals by large hyperscalers to try to reopen, put in new reactors at existing nuclear plants, or reopen them to supply power for new facilities. So that's what we're seeing, kind of a resurgence in nuclear as well. So it's a big, these are, I think, the sort of near-term issues of how do we maintain reliability on the grid and also maintain affordability, because they're trying to bring these projects on very, very quickly. So this is a lot of what we're focused on in terms of kind of the near-term challenges. I think on the side of what this means for clean energy, this is a critical time for clean energy. There's these barriers from the federal administration now in terms of trying to get projects approved, but there is the demand there. There's interest on the part of many of these new loads for them to be clean, right? So they're trying to figure out how to do it, and we're starting to see some, policy action to enable that and to try to make it easier in some cases to bring your own generation, like build some clean energy, speed up interconnections, things like that to enable some of this come online. But we've seen, I don't know how much the number of legislation that have been, a number of bills that have been introduced, but it's pretty substantial. Most states have multiple bills trying to address some of these issues of large loads and how you handle them, with a focus on making sure that the costs are borne by the new loads and not the customers, making sure that they contribute to reliability, and in some cases we're seeing negotiations for them to be able to provide grid support in different ways. Like, we're trying to figure out solutions where the new loads can be helping do grid enhancing technologies, or as part of their negotiations, or demand or flexibility. Debbie was talking about this earlier, the real need for flexibility, and I think there's a big push to try to make sure that particularly data center loads, they do vary, the types of data centers that are being built and how they operate and what their function is. There's differences in how flexible they can be, but there's a big push to try to make sure on the policy front that they're as flexible as possible, and incentivizing them to provide that flexibility to the grid, and the cost savings of reducing their operations for a certain number relatively small number of hours can actually save a lot on the utility side in terms of bringing on new capacity. Yeah, I'll say just, so the policy front, just to kind of wrap up and kind of give you the big picture of, what people are really focused on these issues in the near term. On the reliability side, I mentioned before that it's making sure that we can meet these loads, that we can get the transmission built, increase the flexibility, and make sure that these loads are contributing to the grid services wherever they can. The affordability side, the policymakers are really grappling with these questions of trying to enable economic growth, but also make sure that they're not pushing out other industries. I mean, there's some debate, I think, across states about, do we want these new data center loads or do we want manufacturing loads? Manufacturing loads often offer a lot of additional jobs than a data center load, right? Data centers use a lot of electricity, a lot of water, have a lot of impacts, but they don't bring a lot of jobs. So that's part of the debate. On the clean energy side, I think the other things that I'll mention just in terms of, I'm wrapping up. We're starting to see quite a few states looking at ways to sort of incentivize the data center developers to use clean energy in terms of tax incentive. They often provide economic benefits to the large loads for coming to their state, but making that contingent upon using clean energy, being efficient, providing flexibility, those kinds of things. So we're seeing a lot of that kind of activity as well. So I'll leave it there. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Lori. So much interesting stuff, and obviously we're seeing some significant changes taking place on the policy side here currently. We do have about 10 minutes or so to open up for questions, and I don't know if we have a roving mic out there. It would be good if you could yes, there it is. So does anybody out there have a question? Yes, I see some hands going up.
Hi, quick question for Lori. Are any of the larger corporate loads like data centers, are they pursuing behind the meter microgrid kind of solutions on site, so then is that a path for not waiting for transmission access, things like that?
Yeah, definitely. And Debbie's probably more of an expert on this than I am, because the ESIG has been doing a lot of work on the different formulations of how these loads can be connecting. And it's fairly complicated, but yes, the answer is yes, and that some states are actually encouraging those kinds of solutions. And there's definitely a lot of work looking at it. There's also some regulatory issues around, can you do that? There's been particularly in PJM some issues around trying to do co-location with existing loads. Debbie, do you want to weigh in on that at all?
Sorry, I didn't completely.
Oh, the question was about behind the meter generation configurations.
Right. I mean, I guess, so yeah, one of the reasons that they want to do behind the meter co-location is so they can escape transmission charges, which can be a lot. And so they're saying that they don't use the transmission system at all, and so therefore they shouldn't have to pay that. And then because those transmission charges were being paid by, say, those generators, now those transmission charges are getting turned over to the ratepayers. Like Exelon talks about $123 million annually that now will go to the ratepayers if that data center goes behind the meter at that nuclear plant. And then another thing to just think about is another way to look at the backup generation is that every data center builds backup generation. And that backup generation could be flexible and could provide services to the grid if it were designed to do that. And there is a data center in Wyoming and Cheyenne by Microsoft that was designed just like that, because the utility didn't want to build new generation for that data center. And that Microsoft built a bunch of gas turbines that can be used by the utility when the utility is stressed. So there's good things that can also happen with this.
Well, along those same lines, I'm reading a lot about large natural gas installations for data centers that are going in, and I'm also hearing a lot about nuclear right away, which of course is an impossibility. So I'm looking at the possible opportunities for renewables, namely that if some of these data centers are glomming onto existing nuclear generation on the premise of continuity, this could mean that they are stealing, if you will, capacity from systems that are already there. And I'm just wondering if I'm on the right, if I'm actually catching on to something, that what this means then is if the data centers grab onto existing nuclear, that opens up an opportunity to stabilize and provide more reliable power using renewables for their existing customers who are going to be suffering from this extraction from their existing portfolio, if you will, their base of generation.
Yeah, there's a few different elements to that, and there's both. I would say what's happening with the data center companies is there were some deals that were done where they were just contracting for existing nuclear generation and taking it from others, and I think that was what Debbie was just talking about was also part of that, and then they were saying that they didn't have to pay transmission costs and things. But there's also deals where they're actually adding units to existing nuclear facilities. So some of the other deals that we've been seeing are actually adding new capacity to the system in the next couple of years, and that's the fastest way to develop new nuclear. So to the extent, like, just reshuffling the deck of generation doesn't do anything, right? It just damages the states that are trying to meet their clean electricity standards, and it creates kind of havoc, and you're just kind of shuffling the deck, and it doesn't do anything. It doesn't help with reliability either. But if you're adding new capacity, then it can provide some of those benefits that you suggest. So we are seeing both. I think there's real push and encouragement to try to do this approach of expanding capacity on the system. It's not going to get us very far. You can only do so much with like reshuffling the existing generation that's out there. That you can't do that for very long because we need new stuff on the system. The other thing I'll say is that the thing that's really interesting right now is the federal government is really trying to throw a lot of barriers in the way of wind and solar. But the things that we can build the fastest, and we need to build stuff fast, is the solar and wind and batteries, right? And so we have all these projects queued up, and everyone is scrambling to try to get them done. And the data center providers really want that stuff, at least many of the hyperscalers that have these clean electricity goals. So it's a lot. But they're throwing all these additional barriers in the way. So it's creating uncertainty about how much we can do. The other problem is like, we have queues for natural gas turbines, right? There's a lack of capacity, there's a lack of availability of new gas turbines, right? It takes longer to do those. It takes a long time to do nuclear. What are we going to do, right, if we don't do the wind and solar and batteries? It's hard to build a lot of capacity quickly. So I don't know if others want to, sorry, I'm talking a lot. Someone else.
We'll take another question.
Okay, my question's about flexibility, which you all mentioned. And Richard Perez talked about flexibility on the supply side because that's easier and the utilities already know how to do it. And Debbie, you showed a lot about flexibility on the demand side, mostly focusing on big units. But I'm curious, what's the potential, you think, for adding demand side flexibility because it's more cost effective than supply side flexibility, but expanding it, which would mean relying on smaller, many more smaller resources like thermostats and EVs. So it's a communication control problem. Seems like it has huge potential, but it could be costly because it's new and different. And I think you probably have an opinion about that.
Thanks. I love that question.
But it's also for Debbie. But you first.
Okay. So when we call flexibility, we are agnostic about it. I tend to prefer the supply side, but I don't discount the demand side. Of course, if it's there, use it. The good thing about the supply side is that you can keep the generating capability you have today, build more. We know how to do that. And it's an insurance against any drought of solar and wind. That's the big thing. I kept reading people generating 10,000 years of solar and wind and proving that how you're going to have a giant drought, it's never going to work. The minute you add that that supply side flexibility, you resolve the problem, because if you have a big drought, you're going to run it a bit more, not 5%, maybe 1 year needed 7%, but that's not going to destroy the system. It's going to work all the time. So all flexibility is good, and it's a matter of what's the cheapest bottom line.
So I think if you think back to like that load duration curve kind of framework that we've used in the past a long time ago, the more peaky you get in terms of there being fewer hours where you need lots of resources, demand side flexibility is perfect for that kind of thing, right? You don't want to build something that's just going to run a few hours of the year. You want to use, demand side flexibility for that kind of peakiness. Now, that being said, there are new ways that folks are getting demand side flexibility now to do crazy things in Europe. You should really check out what the UK is doing and their distribution network operators. And I just talked to a guy from Oleander in the Netherlands. They are dispatching demand flexibility real time, day ahead and real time, and they're not only doing it for bulk power system needs, but also for distribution system needs. There's a lot of things that are happening. We're not there yet in the US, I don't know why, but you could look to others to see some real innovation.
Even small stuff.
Yes, they're doing small stuff. They are dispatching people's, thermostats and things like that.
Okay, my name is Amara. I'm from Addis Ababa University, Ethiopia. So I want to ask about so now from the discussion that we have seen that the dominance of solar and wind are actually coming more than 50% on the grid. So how the power signal, the power system stability control mechanism, the small signal and control the power system dynamics control, the two area control, and also the faults current supply. So those are actually controlled, the voltage control, the frequency control, all those are actually done by base loads. So how the technology, how is mature is the technology to do those things currently? Thank you.
Yeah, so I mean, inverter-based resources, wind, solar, and battery energy storage, the control algorithms that are in there can be designed to replicate the same controls that you would see on a system that's based on synchronous generators. And as I was showing earlier, I can make a system of any size that is 100% inverter-based. And on small island power systems, we do it quite often. So we have no synchronous generators running. It's really, at the end of the day, it's a matter of costs. So are the costs of putting in those inverter-based resources with that level of control and that ability to provide all the necessary grid services equal or less than the synchronous generators that are deployed out there? So the places that you're going to see these kind of really big inverter-based grids, things like the Hawaiian Islands, those are grids that are substantial. They have generation spread all over. They have transmission distribution systems. They have to solve all of those issues. Places like Ireland, places like Texas are also, and the grids of Australia, those systems are already on their way to push as fast as they can to extremely high levels of inverter-based grids. Now, depends on your set of other resources. Like, for example, in Texas, they have some nuclear power plants. They're not going to turn those off. They're going to keep those running. So that probably will not ever get to, say, 100% inverter-based system. But around the world, you're going to just tap into your available resources and make the best use of what you can do economically. But you can solve all the technical, dynamic stability challenges, protection challenges of a normal grid with inverter-based resources.
Oh, sorry.
I'm just taking the mic so I can close out this session because I know we have to get ready for the closing session. This has really been a fascinating panel discussion, and I do want to give each panelist an opportunity to quickly give everyone sort of a takeaway message that they'd like to have them hear before we close out the panel completely. And I'll start with Richard, since you're the closest to the mic.
Well, my takeaway is that any country, any regions in the world can do 100% renewable if you do things which are not in the system right now. And the biggest thing to do is that we call implicit storage, overbuild resources and build them into the system. Number two is change the market rules, because they are not helpful today to develop those ideal solutions.
My two takeaways are we need to build more transmission in this country, and that's going to allow us to build less generation and save money, and that we need to use demand flexibility. We are so behind in this. It turns out you don't even need huge price signals to get demand flexibility. You just have to make it easy for people to do. That's it.
I would say that in general, everyone around the country is going to agree to affordable, reliable, and secure electricity. And there are many ways to get there, and you have to make use of the best resources that you have available. But wind and solar are going to be a key component to that, of providing affordable electricity. And we need to look at ways to make sure that those systems are deployed at the scale that really makes a difference.
I just want to say, I think we have this opportunity now with these growing loads. It's a lot of new generation that we'll be adding to the system, and we need to make sure that we're making progress on all of these things, including the transmission front, making sure that they're as flexible as possible and clean as possible. And because there are folks, there's a lot of negative stuff from the federal administration, but there's a lot of reasons why we might be able to make that happen. So we had to make this opportunity happen.